It was a dark morning, as if the whole city sighed in anticipation of something bad. The overcast sky, the shabby facades of the houses, and the empty streets, as if the world had frozen, hidden in its shadows. An incomprehensible anxiety hung in the air, as if before a storm, but there was no rain or wind. It was just a vague, heightened feeling that no one could explain exactly. The bus, old and mossy, pumped its wheels on the wet asphalt, breaking the silence. There were only a few people inside, and they seemed to be hiding in their thoughts. One of them was a teenager, bleary-eyed, tired but collected. He sat by the window, not looking at the other cars and buildings as if they didn't exist. There was room in his mind for only one thought: how to get through this day and get home alive. 18 years old, and the world had already had time to show him how cruel it was. The shadow of his face almost blended into the gloom, and only the flicker of the sparse streetlights poked through the dirty windows. He didn't notice the bus had stopped, everything was under control in his mind. But then he got off. The bus doors opened, and the boy, not knowing what awaited him, stepped onto the sidewalk. At that moment his feet touched the wet asphalt, and his footsteps merged with the cold, empty city. He looked up when he heard a siren blare. On the opposite side of the street, between the rows of old buildings, a police patrol was moving. It wasn't the first day he'd patrolled these streets, and it wouldn't be the last. He was used to these neighborhoods, grim, featureless, full of danger at every turn. The policeman was experienced, with a stern face, and for all his appearance seemed unshakable. He looked down on everything, knowing that he was the one who kept order in his hands. When his gaze happened to meet the teenagers, he saw nothing but menace in him. This guy, something was off. Something in his gait, in his confidence. As soon as his eyes met the boys, the cop felt an unease rise in his stomach. But it wasn't the kind of feeling that would make him stop. On the contrary, it awakened in him an unconscious but persistent certainty that he was right. The teenager didn't see this patrol approaching until he heard the sound of brakes approaching and felt someone pull up beside him. His heart quickened its rhythm, but he held on. Immersed in his thoughts, he didn't realize that for him, not just a new day was beginning, for him, a test was beginning that would change everything. The policeman got out of the car, and his footsteps sounded like a sentence. He walked straight up to the boy. No words, no explanations, just stood there like a stone wall, not a shred of doubt in his eyes. "Do you know what you're doing here?" His voice was low and cold, as if this street had become his property. The teen squirmed slightly, but didn't back down. He knew none of this was an accident. His intuition said it would be difficult. But what no one knew was that this moment was the first step toward a destiny that would shake everything. And this policeman, confident of his impunity, could not realize that what seemed to him to be a routine patrol would soon become a disaster. The teenager's every step echoed in the empty, gray city. He walked down the street, ignoring the cold wind that tried to penetrate his thick sweater. He was almost to the corner when he heard the roar of a patrol car's engine. The teen paused, but only for a moment. He knew this wasn't just an accident. Too many times he'd seen the streets of this neighborhood come alive when the police appeared on the horizon. The car slowed down and stopped right at the sidewalk. The policeman looked out of the window, his eyes immediately fixed on the teenager. There was no curiosity in his gaze, no desire to understand the situation. There was something dark, almost mocking, as if the world they were both in had been split in two. The teen felt something inside clench. He wasn't a criminal, he wasn't a trespasser. He was just walking home, but for some reason this patrol had chosen him. Why? He didn't know. The policeman opened the car door, unhurriedly, but with clear intent. His footsteps sounded against the silence, and each one was like a hammer blow on an unbreakable hard surface. He approached the teenager, standing beside him like a huge shadow that absorbed the light. "Hey, kid, stop," he said, voice harsh, curt. "What are you doing here?" The teenager looked up. His breathing quickened, he tried to remain calm, but anxiety was building inside. He knew the cop had seen him and noticed not just a teenager, but someone easy to blame. A dark-skinned man. "Come here, I'll talk to you." The policeman stepped closer, leaving no room for resistance. His voice was harsh and his gaze was judgmental. The boy stood still, trying to figure out what to do. He knew that any movement could lead to something terrible, but he also knew he couldn't just walk away. The police were not a friend here, but a threat. And threats always seem to come to people like him. "What, you don't think we can see you?" The policeman continued, a contemptuous grin appearing on his face. "I see your face. You here in our neighborhood must be either a criminal or someone who's up to something. So, what do you say?" The boy swallowed, feeling the heat rising in his chest, but at the same time his hands grew icy cold. He tried to gather his thoughts, but the words stuck. How could he explain that he was just going home? That his race didn't make him a criminal? "I'm not. I'm just going home," he said, but his voice sounded quiet, with obvious worry. The policeman leaned ominously toward him, his face close. "Just going home, you say? Somehow I don't believe it. Can't you see what's here? You're not supposed to be here. You're dark-skinned, which means you're a danger." Those words pierced the teenager like a knife to the chest. He felt his pride crumble, as if he had just been accused of something he hadn't even done. He wanted to say something else, to respond, but he knew it wouldn't help. All he could do was remain silent and wait to see how the situation unfolded. "Don't you realize what you're looking at?" The policeman didn't remove his gaze, and his tone became even more mocking. "You need to learn to respect the laws. Do you understand what I'm saying?" The teen felt his heart beating faster and the tension rising. He couldn't leave, couldn't just walk past. Stopping, he found himself trapped. The policeman took a step forward, his hand sliding to his belt where the gun was visible. The teenager flinched instinctively, his eyes darting around. Yet he didn't move away. "I don't need you, kid," the cop said, grabbing him by the shoulder and pushing him hard toward the sidewalk. "Crawl." The boy froze, unable to believe his ears. "What?" He wanted to answer, wanted to fight, but the words stuck. There was no hint of regret in the policeman's eyes. He was confident in his power, in the fact that he could control someone's fate. And now this teenager was his victim. The policeman, smiling mockingly, watched the boy drop to his knees with difficulty. "That's the way it is, kid. You need to realize what it's like to be beneath everyone you once considered equal." The teenager felt his face burn with shame. But what was worse was the realization that no one would help him. And the more he continued to crawl along the dirty sidewalk, the more hope faded in him. This wasn't just humiliation. It was something that would leave a lifelong mark. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you are hearing our stories from, and whether you have had similar moments in your life when you faced injustice or bias. We value every opinion you have. If you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new chapters. And now we continue. The policeman stood in front of the teenager, his face as hard and unyielding as a wall. He clenched his fists, glaring at the boy, who still sat on his knees, feeling the ground beneath him grow colder. The teenager couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: something about this moment was wrong. This policeman didn't just see him as a young man, he saw him as a threat. But why? Because of the color of his skin? Because of the way he looked? Are you aware of what's going on here? The policeman exhaled, keeping his gaze on him. You know the laws here demand respect. And you, boy, clearly don't respect them. You think you can just walk these streets like nothing happened. The teenager couldn't get a word out. The words were stuck in his throat. He felt his inner world crumbling and his vulnerability opening the way for more humiliation. He hoped this would all be over. He'd thought that maybe the policeman was just mistaken, that this was all a misunderstanding. But now, with every word he said, it was becoming clear, this wasn't just a detention. This was a game the teenager couldn't win. Don't you think you look like a criminal? The policeman continued, his voice growing more and more ominous. He took his time, choosing each word so that it cut sharper into his soul. You hide behind that skin too often. You don't want to tell me you're not a drug dealer, do you? You think I can't see you hiding something in your pockets? The teenager, feeling the bonds of fear tightening in his chest, slowly raised his hand to say that he had nothing, that he was not doing anything criminal. But the policeman did not let him say a word. He grabbed his arm sharply, yanking him downward with force. You don't have to lie to me, understand? His voice became hoarse and his gaze became cold, full of hatred. Are you going to tell me again that you don't know what this means? What are you, anyway? Just another nigger who thinks he can get away with anything. Those words struck the teenager like a hammer blow. He couldn't move. His mind was a storm of emotions, from rage to fear. The policeman, on the other hand, continued to taunt, savoring the moment. His face was contorted with contempt and his voice hoarse and sinister. So you want it to be easy? You want to get away without consequences? The policeman stepped around the teenager like a predator ready to attack. He looked down at his bent knees. That's how you learn to respect me and the law. He stood directly in front of the teen, and his words pierced the silence like a gunshot. Get on your knees. The teenager froze. His body was tense, and his soul was torn with pain and humiliation. He tried to gather the rest of his strength, but fear had already taken over him. He knew that if he went up, his life wouldn't be the same. And at the same time he realized, he couldn't just submit. But what was left when this policeman stood in front of you, as if you were not a human being but the embodiment of the law, with racism and hatred woven in? The policeman tugged on his shoulder again, forcing him to stand up. You're not going to cross me, kid. Get on your knees and crawl. That's how you'll learn to respect the rules. The teenager realized that if he looked up, the whole world would be watching him being humiliated. He wanted to explode, wanted to fight, but what could he do? In front of him stood not just the force of the law, stood his contempt, veiled in the laws and rules that should have protected him. But instead of protection, he felt only a suffocating sense of helplessness. Crawl, the policeman said, laughing. I want to watch you crawl down a dirty sidewalk like someone who deserves it. He stepped back, looking at the teenager with contempt, his eyes glittering, and it was worse than any blow. The policeman watched the boy sink to his knees, clenching his teeth, and began to crawl down the dirty sidewalk, losing his pride with every step. And what was even scarier, the cop was laughing. It wasn't just humiliation. It was more than that. It was a weapon. Every step, every inch that the teenager moved on the dirty sidewalk felt like a blow to his very essence. He couldn't believe this was happening to him, that his life, his future was being compressed into these few horrible moments. The policeman stood and watched, his eyes gleaming with contempt and his lips curved in a sneer. He savored every moment of this humiliation. The teenager could feel the dirt flooding his hands, sticking to his skin, to his clothes. The smell was in the air, rotten, damp, and it was all part of what was happening to him. He tried not to think about how his pride was slipping away with every step. He wanted to stop, but he couldn't. Something inside told him that if he stopped, if he showed even the slightest weakness, it would lead to even worse. But as soon as he took a single step, his hands touching the ground, he felt his humiliation growing. That's the way it is, kid. You probably thought you were going to get away with it, didn't you? The policeman's voice was full of mockery, every word like a slap in the face. What, you think you have the right to walk these streets as you please? You're nothing but dirt on these sidewalks. The teenager did not know what to say. What could he say when words were empty in a world where racism was not just a problem, but a system, and humiliation was the norm? He tried to keep from crying, but he could feel himself losing himself, his confidence fading with each passing second. His thoughts were confused, but there was one clear feeling: he wasn't a person to this policeman. He was just an object to be laughed at, to be played with. "Do you crawl all the time?" The policeman paced behind him with his hands on his belt, as if he was not just an observer but the master of the place. "You think you deserve respect? What are you? Just another dark boy who hasn't figured out how the world works." The teenager gritted his teeth, but every cell in him screamed in pain and shame. He felt his own thoughts, his own feelings crumbling. Each step on the dirty sidewalk became harder, his legs refusing to move. He no longer knew how long he would be forced to crawl, how many times his dignity would be crushed by this humiliation. The policeman continued to follow him without removing his gaze. With every step the teenager took, his laughter grew louder, and it sounded like confirmation that his life was worthless on these streets. His every word, his every gesture was imbued with contempt, and the teenager realized more and more: this wasn't just a detention. This was a public punishment in which his race became the deciding factor. He was not just a lawbreaker, he was someone who could be destroyed without consequence. "So, ain't you tired yet, nigger?" The cop took a step forward, laughing. "How do you like being where you are? I mean, you could have been something more, but you chose this filth. You're all the same to us." Those words hurt like a knife in the back. The teenager clenched his lips, feeling something tearing inside him. He couldn't stop, couldn't even stand up, couldn't give himself license to fight. The only thing in his mind was that if he stood up, if he even showed the policeman that he could resist, it would backfire even more. But it was at that very moment that he realized that he had already lost everything. His honor, his pride, his identity, everything had been dragged out of him like dirt from the sidewalk. A realization flashed through his mind. He wasn't forced to crawl through these streets because he was a criminal. No, he was forced to crawl because his race put him in this position. It was a symbol. A symbol of power that overwhelmed him, a personification that he was never equal to others. He was an outsider on these streets, an outsider in a system in which he wasn't even considered human. But worst of all, he realized that it wasn't just happening to him. It was happening to everyone like him, every day. It was part of the system, part of the order that created this world. And all that was left was to crawl and hope he didn't go mad from this humiliation. Small pebbles and pieces of debris pierced the teenager's skin, each step becoming more and more painful, as if the pain were burning him from the inside out. He couldn't straighten up, couldn't stand up, because the policeman was standing right in front of him, with a distinct contempt on his face, as if expecting more humiliation from him. The teenager felt himself losing strength with each crawling step, losing his self-respect, losing everything that had once held him in this world. The policeman stood a few steps away from him, enjoying the spectacle. He was not only watching, but also supporting the process with his laughter, his facial expression, which was full of confidence that everything that was happening was absolutely justified. "Come on, kid, crawl on," his voice was icy and husky, with the very sneer that made the teenager feel not just helpless, but also insignificant. "What, you don't think you need to be responsible for this? I mean, everyone sees you crawling around. You probably want to be pitied, don't you? Well, you won't. I don't feel sorry for you." He raised his hand slightly, pointing along the street as if the teenager was not a person but a toy to be controlled. "You have to crawl to the end of the street, all the way to the end, to feel that you don't deserve anything more than dirt. I don't want you to think you can get away with this. You and your kind should always be on your knees." The policeman stepped forward, filling the space around the teenager with his huge body. He leaned down and spoke again, his voice sounding more and more aggressive, with a deep, contemptuous tone. "Don't think your skin and your history make you special. You're just another Negro who thinks the world owes him. You've lost all value. And I'm gonna watch you crawl. Crawl like everyone else like you. With every word the policeman said, the teenager felt his body losing strength, how it simply refused to rise. He wanted this moment to end, wanted to be free of it all. But the pain, physical and mental, had become too much to keep fighting. Every movement was torture, every step a wasted effort that only deepened the feeling of his own insignificance. "So, you're having a hard time, huh?" The policeman continued, taking another step forward, his words were like spikes. "Come on, boy, crawl. You deserve it." He sounded confident that his actions were within the law, that what he was doing was part of his job. He didn't feel the slightest guilt or doubt. He sincerely believed that a teenager was not just a person, but an object to be abused with impunity. The teen tried to force himself to move, even though every cell in his body was screaming for him to stop. He knew that any resistance would be another dose of ridicule, another dose of humiliation. He couldn't stop, because he knew that if he stood up, if he showed weakness for even a moment, the consequences would be even worse. "You have to understand," the policeman continued, his voice even more menacing. "You are nothing. You don't deserve to be on equal footing with us. You're crawling because we order you to crawl. And you will crawl until you realize that you are nothing. That your entire existence is just a mistake that needs to be corrected." The policeman's tone became more and more cruel, his laughter sounding like a sinister chorus filled with malice and contempt. The teenager felt his world crumbling with each new word, with each blow to his dignity. He couldn't feel his legs anymore, only the pain that followed him all over his body, a fiery pain leaving marks on his soul. But what was worst of all was the realization that he couldn't stop the process. He couldn't say a word, couldn't get up, couldn't do anything. He was just a pawn in someone else's game, and all he could do was move silently, not noticing his dignity and pride dying with every step. Every step on the dirty sidewalk felt like a nail in his body. Rocks, debris, spilled oil, it all penetrated his skin, leaving marks that couldn't be erased. But what remained inside was much deeper. It wasn't just physical pain. It was something darker and more destructive, something that was eating him up from the inside out like acid. The teenager felt his inner world crumbling with every moment of humiliation. "That's it," he heard again, the police officer's gruff voice. "You crawl like all your brothers. Like a slave who must learn his place." Those words seemed to burn his soul like fire. He couldn't take it anymore. His thoughts intertwined like a net, each one pulling him toward rage. "I am not a slave. I shouldn't be on my knees. I shouldn't have to endure this." These thoughts filled his head. He felt the rage begin to boil in his chest as the urge to stand up, to tear this humiliating picture and show that he was not broken, filled him with giddiness. His fingers clenched, and the poison seemed to spread beneath his fingernails. Emotions raged inside him, aggression, pain, hatred. Everything in him demanded resistance. Everything was screaming at him, "Resist. You shouldn't be here, you shouldn't let this policeman take your humanity away from you." He could feel every molecule of his body wanting to rebel, but his every movement indicated that resistance would only make things worse. "Why don't you say anything? Afraid I'll kill you, kid?" The policeman continued, his eyes sparkling with pleasure. "You have no right to be here, you have no right to walk these streets. You're not our equal." The teenager knew the policeman wouldn't stop. He wasn't just a patrolman, he was part of a system that was rigged against him from the beginning. A system that considered him less than a human being simply because he was black. This moment was not just a fight for his own dignity. It was a fight against the entire system that made him what he was in the eyes of the police officer, a nothing, an empty object to be manipulated, to be played with. But here was the most difficult thing. In this moment, amidst the pain and humiliation, the teenager realized that he could not allow himself to be aggressive. He could not allow himself to raise his hand or scream, because he knew that at that moment the whole system would be against him. All this aggression would come back to him with double force. He wanted to get up, wanted to throw that awful look at the policeman, but he realized that if he made one wrong move, if he even showed weakness, he would lose everything he already had. He was losing his dignity, his pride, his faith in people. He was losing himself. But worst of all, he knew this moment wasn't going to end quickly. This wasn't just an incident. This was a pressure that would take more from him than he could have ever imagined. "You can't beat me, understand?" came the hoarse voice again. "You're nothing. You're going to crawl all the way to the end. And then I'll make you stand up, and you'll keep going. You'll always know who you really are." Those words hit like a fist to the stomach again. The teenager felt his chest tighten and his breathing become heavy. He tried to imagine what could be after this. Where would one find strength? How could one fight something that couldn't be changed? His heart raced with each step, but with each step his confidence melted. "Crawl on," came the voice of the policeman again. His laughter was like a poisonous veil surrounding them. The teenager realized that to crawl on meant to go along with it. But a firm thought was brewing in his soul: he couldn't give up. He couldn't allow himself to be broken. He was not a slave, and he would not allow this policeman to destroy his human dignity. Every step now was an act of resistance, not external, but internal. A spark ignited in his chest. Even if he couldn't stand up and confront this cop now, even if he couldn't do anything to change this moment, he knew that spark wouldn't go away. It would grow. And someday, in another place and another time, that spark would become the fire that would make the world hear him. Before we continue, let's pause for one more brief moment. Write in the comments where you're hearing our stories from, and whether you've had something similar in your life, moments when you've faced injustice or felt misunderstood. Share your experiences. And if you like what you hear, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new chapters. And now we continue. While the teenager kept moving forward, sinking lower, giving up the last piece of his pride, the world around him continued to exist in its usual, indifferent rhythm. There were no people on the street except him and the policeman, and every step he took was like his last, like a moment in which he was finally losing himself. He could hardly feel the dirt under his hands anymore, no longer felt the pain in his body. Everything had merged into something more than physical humiliation. It was a fight for his soul, for his right to exist. But at that moment, when every cell in his body had almost given up, an unknown shadow, as if from nowhere, broke that cruel silence. He heard footsteps first. Rhythmic and steady, not hurried, but clearly signaling the approach of someone important. The teenager wanted to turn his head, but he couldn't. He wasn't sure that made any sense at all. Who else could be here? This neighborhood was empty. He was so alone in his misery that even the air itself seemed indifferent. But the footsteps drew nearer, and suddenly there came a voice, calm at first, but with ineffable authority. "Hey, what's going on?" That voice was familiar. The teenager struggled to look up, and though the sight was blurry, he recognized it immediately. It was his father. Yes, it was him exactly. His stern, confident, yet soft voice. The lawyer he had always known as the calmest man in the world, the one who could solve any question, settle any problem. Someone who would never let his son be in this situation. The policeman turned, and the teenager saw his face twist first in surprise, and then a barely perceptible grin appear on his lips. He clearly hadn't expected anyone to interfere with this picture. But when he saw the man in the expensive suit, with his confident posture and steady gaze, his expression changed for a moment, as if this man was not just a witness, but someone the policeman did not dare to ignore. "What are you doing here?" the policeman asked, making no secret of his wariness. He tried to remain calm, but it was clear that for a moment his confidence was shaken. The teenager's father stepped closer, unhurriedly, with the same dignity that had always been his hallmark. He looked at his son carefully, and his eyes were at once filled with sympathy and anger. He realized at once what had happened. He saw how his son had been humiliated, how the policeman had manipulated the situation, how he didn't really know who he was dealing with. "What's going on here?" he asked again, more clearly, with a tense, cold tone that made the policeman retreat for a moment. His voice was like an icy wind that blew away illusions of impunity. "You seem to have decided that your law is the only truth. But you seem to have forgotten that there are other laws." The policeman fell silent. His expression changed, and he seemed to try several times to find a suitable answer, but the words would not come. He realized that he was facing not just a passerby, but a man who knew the law, who understood the intricacies of justice. A man who was a lawyer, a man who had once handled important cases and won in the courts, tearing lies and corruption apart. "I don't like your tone, sir," the policeman said, trying to maintain control. But his voice was no longer as confident as it used to be. He felt like he was losing ground, and his aggression was only making things worse. The teenager's father looked at him with such an expression that the policeman, before he could think of what to say, found himself in a defensive position. He couldn't continue his game with this man, his look was too judgmental. "My son didn't commit a crime," the father said, already clearly without any doubt in his voice. "You can't just stop him, humiliate him because he's dark-skinned. You can't force your false truth on him because you're in uniform. You have a responsibility to protect people, not be a tool to destroy their dignity." The policeman shook his head nervously, trying to justify himself, but the words were not convincing. He knew that here, in front of his lawyer, he was completely exposed. He wasn't ready to fight the man who knew how to tear apart his false excuses. You don't understand," he tried to justify himself, but the words weren't coming again. He should have obeyed. Obey? Obey what? His father interrupted him. Submit to being your judge and executioner. Submit to your racially biased judgments. You insult not only my son, but also the law you supposedly defend. The silence that came after these words was deafening. The policeman was trapped, and his face was giving out more and more in shades of red. He knew he was wrong. He felt his confidence crumble as the whole scene he had created disappeared before his eyes. And now he was one of those who would be investigated, one of the many victims of his own delusions and hubris. The teenager looked at his father, and a spark reignited inside him. Not a spark of rage, but a spark of hope. He felt his inner struggle, his humiliation, finally beginning to end this nightmare. The policeman began to retreat, not knowing what to do, how to act. He realized that now he could not win. And even if he tried to say something, his words had no weight. All he could do was to remain silent. "We're leaving," the father said, turning to his son. "Are you okay?" The teenager raised his head, and his gaze met his father's eyes. There was no shame or pain in their eyes, there was strength. The strength he'd missed so much. The teenager's father stepped forward, unhurried but confident, his posture as stern and unmistakable as his gaze. The policeman stepped back for a moment, as if he could feel the space around him shrinking as his confidence began to melt. He stood, almost unmoving, his gaze darting through the air, and it was obvious that a situation that had seemed to him to be in control had suddenly gone awry. The teenager turned around and immediately saw him, his father, standing there in complete calmness, but with such intensity in his eyes that the policeman seemed to almost choke with tension. The moment was so unexpected to him that he stood still for a moment, trying to realize what was happening. "What do you allow yourself?" His father's voice was clear, unrelenting, like an icy stream that penetrates to the very depths of the soul. His words were directed at the policeman, but they sounded as if he were speaking not only to him, but to the system that allowed such things to happen. The policeman tried to squeeze out something in response, but the words were empty. He was shocked that he was facing not just a man, but someone who could ruin his entire career if he wanted to. He realized that he was facing someone who not only knew the laws, but understood how to use them. Which meant one thing: he couldn't just walk away from this place with minimal repercussions. "Get away from my son," the teen's father spoke softly now, but his voice was full of authority. He took a step forward, and the policeman seemed to feel his space shrinking. He knew he needed to find the words, to say something, but instead he fell silent, standing before this man who was not just a threat to him, but a real danger. A spark of nervousness flickered in his eyes. It was the moment when he began to realize that this incident would probably turn out to be the worst mistake of his life. The teen's father took him by the shoulder and pulled him aside, sending a clear signal that he was now in control of the situation. His hand was steady, he didn't look at his son, but his actions spoke for themselves. Things would be different now. The policeman finally spoke, but his words didn't sound convincing. I was doing my job. That boy was acting suspiciously. He should have complied. Obey what? His father interrupted him, and his voice became firmer, almost insulting to the policeman. Submit to the fact that you yourself decided he was a criminal. You saw him and decided that just because of his looks he must be guilty. You weren't here to defend the law. You were here to humiliate. And I will not allow you to continue. The policeman swallowed nervously, his face beginning to redden. He knew that every answer he gave now would only make things worse. He tried to justify himself, but he no longer believed in what he was saying. He didn't tell me who he was. He didn't, the policeman tried to say, but his voice trembled. He realized that his excuses were nothing more than an attempt to cover up his own powerlessness. He was trapped, and now he couldn't get out. I'm a lawyer, the teen's father said, his voice even clearer. And I'm going to make sure your actions don't go without consequences. You can't treat people like this. You can't be court, jury, and executor all in one person. You broke the law. And if you don't understand what that means, you might want to think about your career. Every word my father said was like a hammer blow to the policeman. The policeman was clearly unprepared for this turn, and it seemed to throw him off balance. He had lost his confidence. He tried to say something again, but nothing came out of his mouth but a nervous mumble. You think you're going to get away with this incident? The teen's father continued, his voice growing more and more commanding. You think you can just take a man's life and break it without thinking of the consequences? It doesn't work that way. I won't let it happen. The policeman felt his confidence slipping away, and instead of looking commanding, he began to look vulnerable. He knew that nothing he said mattered now. His actions had been recorded, his misconduct was obvious, and now it was part of a new, unpredictable plot. I don't know who you are, the policeman muttered, no longer believing his own words, but I didn't mean it. The teenager's father took another step forward, not taking his eyes off the policeman. He didn't feel the slightest regret. There was anger in his eyes, but also clarity. He would not let this policeman get away without consequences. He knew that this was not just an incident to be forgotten. This was the beginning of something that was going to bring down the system that allowed such incidents to happen. You wanted that boy to crawl down the sidewalk like a slave, and you thought you could get away with it. I promise you that you'll know what it's like when you're not the one deciding who's worthy of respect, the teen's father said, his words like a final sentence. The policeman, as if in surrender, stepped back. He couldn't say anything, because he knew this moment would cost him too much. With each passing moment, the tension in the air became more palpable. After the words of the teenager's father, the policeman stood like an armored figure, trying to find a solution that wouldn't put him in an even worse position. But the situation continued to unfold on an entirely different level. The silence that came after the lawyer's words was broken by the sounds of cars approaching, quickly and with clear intent. Someone here knew what was going on. Another patrol car was the first to arrive, followed shortly by several more. The policemen got out of the cars with the same hard faces, the same confident looks, as if it were just another call. But seeing the situation they were in, the expressions on their faces began to change. They felt the tone of the scene change. What's going on here? One of them, a senior officer, soon approached the policeman who had been standing in front of the teenager earlier. His eyes fixed on the son and his father in an instant. The older policeman slowed his step, noticing how tense the whole scene stood, as if the sky itself was bearing down on them with the weight of the truth. He tried to crawl on the sidewalk. The one who had just been the instigator of this humiliation replied stammeringly. He clearly didn't know how to justify himself to the new arrival of reinforcements. The teenager stood, still not believing that finally someone had come to stop this lawlessness. His gaze was tired, but a different light now burned in his eyes. He didn't know how this day would end, but now he felt that his fight mattered. Suddenly, another person appeared among the police officers, a woman with a camera. She seemed to materialize on the spot. The woman, in a black jacket and with a camera pointed directly at the police officers and their face, already knew that her presence would not be just a coincidence. She immediately began recording what was happening. "Are you out of your mind?" Her voice was loud, firm, penetrating to the core of what was happening. "Who gave you the right to treat that boy like that?" The teenager and his father turned their attention to her. This journalist, despite her calm posture, was more than just an observer. She was the kind of person who could not afford to be impartial when she saw such brutality. And now, with her camera, she was turning into a witness to what could be the biggest scandal in the neighborhood. "I'm filming this. I'm going to show the world what's going on here. And if you think you can hide your actions, you might want to think again," the woman with the camera continued, undistracted. The policeman standing in front of the teenager felt his world begin to crumble. He nervously glanced around his colleagues, trying to find support. But he realized the situation was out of his control. The teen's father, standing confidently by his son's side, looked at the policeman with such coldness in his eyes that he could barely stand it. He realized that this wasn't just a public humiliation, it was now directed at the system behind him. The journalist did not stop filming, and now, with every move she made, it was obvious, this moment would be hyped in the public like fire. This footage would not go unnoticed. Which meant that for the cops, every next move was now doubly important. The teenager's lawyer, standing silently by, knew that the moment had come when every word he said would matter. "I will not allow his life to be ruined for such an act of cruelty," the teen's father said, his voice even more determined. "You can't just treat people like this, violate their rights and destroy their dignity, and then think you can get away with it all. I will fight for my son. And I will not stop." And it was at this point, when the public was beginning to take steps to discuss what was happening, that the police began to feel the pressure. The atmosphere around them seemed to shrink and their actions became open to scrutiny. They knew that their mistakes would now be judged not only by their colleagues, but also by the whole society. Every step was no longer just a professional mistake, but an act that could lead to consequences and change their lives. The teenager felt his body finally relax. He was no longer the boy who had struggled to crawl along the dirty sidewalk. He was standing here, next to his father, and he could see the real storm beginning to unfold over this incident. This was not just a local incident. This was becoming a symbol of the fight for justice, the fight against racism, the fight for rights that are so often ignored. The situation was becoming more than just an incident on the street. This was the moment when questions began to be raised about the system, about racial bias, about those who protect and defend but don't always do it right. And now, with every footage recorded, with every question from the reporter, with every word from the lawyer, the situation became more deafening. Every step, every word was now taken with great consequences. People were beginning to realize that they were not just witnessing another case of police brutality, they were witnessing a possible judicial precedent that could change a lot of things. Several days passed, but the tension that had filled the air on the day everything happened had not abated. The world seemed to cease to be the same for all who witnessed the incident. The story, which began as just another of many incidents, quickly gained public importance. The journalist, with her camera and daring approach, had provided the necessary evidence, and now all eyes were on the policeman, who seemed confident that his actions would go without consequence. But now he was under the microscope, and all he had to do was to survive this terrible moment. The policeman, whose gaze increasingly lost confidence, found himself under investigation. Soon after the situation became a high-profile discussion in the media, calls and demands from public organizations, human rights defenders and activists began to pour in. This was just the beginning. Although he was a man of the law, it was his own mistakes that led to a breakdown of trust between him and what he believed to be his truth. The teenager's father, a lawyer, was at the center of this crisis, although his thoughts were not focused solely on revenge. He was deeply convinced that it was not justice in the form of retribution, but change in the system that should result from this event. He knew that the police officer who humiliated his son was not just an individual incapable of self-control. He was part of a larger structure, a system that, despite its rules, sometimes covers up the very biased attitudes and actions that lead to such violent incidents. Support from human rights organizations was strong, and they offered their resources to prove in court that the police officer's actions were not just one man's mistake, but a manifestation of broader systemic problems. For the lawyer, this was a chance to prove that his son was the victim not only of personal aggression, but also of structural racism that lurked in the very foundations of the law enforcement system. But the struggle wasn't just external, it was internal. The teenager, while proud that his father had stood up for him, also felt the weight of having his name now associated with this high-profile case. He knew that with each passing day, the world would be watching, and that attention to his family would be inevitable. Sometimes he wondered if he would ever feel normal again, knowing that his story had become a symbol that had become a topic of discussion in every corner of the country. Could he just go back to his normal life, or would his life, like his family's, now be under constant scrutiny? "Do you think things will change after this?" he asked one evening, sitting with his father on the couch. His father didn't answer right away, thinking over each answer. "I don't think things will change right away," he said, looking into his son's eyes. "But that doesn't mean nothing will change. We can't make all people understand, but we can make the system realize its mistakes. And that will already be a step toward change." Meanwhile, the police officer on whom the investigative process was imposed was already beginning to feel the consequences. He found himself in a situation in which his career, his reputation, everything he considered important, was jeopardized. The public pressure was getting stronger and stronger, and his own colleagues began to avoid contact with him. Regardless of what he said, his words could not erase the obviousness of his action. He was exposed, and his life was no longer the same. With each passing day, the trial became more and more tense. The teen's lawyer and human rights activists built up the pressure, emphasizing that this was not just the isolation of one case, but an entire problem. From lawsuits to bills, they pushed for reform in the very workings of law enforcement to eliminate discrimination at all levels. Once, when the teen's lawyer was being interviewed live on air, he said, "We can't just be spectators, we can't just sit back and wait for things to get better. We have to demand change. We have to demand respect, equality and justice." All this did not go unnoticed. Eventually, the cop was fired and stripped of his license to serve. But that was only the beginning. Absorbed in a process of self-discovery and realization, he experienced what for him was an inevitable reckoning. He found himself one of many who had run afoul of a system that had long allowed such actions to go without consequence. Though his career was over, his personal struggle for justice was far from over. He became a part of history that he could not forget. For the teenager and his family, the case was a lesson learned, but they knew they had a long way to go now that change was beginning to happen. The system they were trying to break was powerful, and they couldn't afford to relax. But they also knew that every step along the way was a step toward a better future. When the trial came to an end and the final public reaction was delivered, the teenager could feel how this event had changed him. He was no longer the boy who walked modestly and silently down the street. He was part of something bigger, and his life was now a symbol that even in the most difficult circumstances one can find the strength to fight. And amidst all this change, at this moment, as the case came to a close, an important question remained: how will all this change the fates of all those involved in this case? How many more such moments would it take for the system to change? And if the policeman had the opportunity to go back in time, what would he do? But for all those who were involved in this struggle, this moment became a point of reference. It was the moment when they realized that no matter what happens next, these trials will not be forgotten. Change would begin here and now, and eventually they would be able to build a world where such incidents would not happen again. We want to know what you think about this story. Have you experienced or observed any cases of racism in your life? Your opinions and experiences are very important to us, and we value each and every one of you. Share your thoughts in the comments, we'll be sure to read everything. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give us a like if you liked it. Your feedback helps us a lot to move forward and make the content better. Wishing you a good day, and if you've listened to the end, write in the comments, the changes will start here. We'll know you're with us all the way to the end.